Hello, welcome to part 2 of America's Presidents in Bits and Pieces. In part 1 we covered up to the Civil War. In this part 2 we're going to cover from the Civil War up until the beginning of the 20th century. And in part 3 we'll cover the remainder and look at some statistics perhaps. One of the, in my estimation, greatest presidents the United States had, dealing at the moment with the real critical question in the United States of slavery, the split of the Union. The future of the United States looked very doubtful at this point in time. And along came Abraham Lincoln, a presidential-looking person. Very tall, he was 6'4", and then he wore a very tall top hat on top of that, so he was 6'8" or taller in appearance. He was very strong, wiry type individual. When he grew up in Illinois, he was a rail splitter, farmhand. He has a brown belt in judo. He was inducted into the Wrestling Hall of Fame. He was very convinced in his ideas and what he wanted to have happen in the government of the United States at this time. And he was very good at getting compromise. So he was able to get people to do what he wanted to do. And that was one of his great successes. You probably heard about the fact that he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended slavery. In actual fact, the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't ratified till after his death, but it still came in and ended slavery, a law against having slaves. You may be aware of the infamous Gettysburg Address, the 77 years ago type address. He was on a train going to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He knew that he had to make a speech, so he pulled out an envelope from his pocket and he wrote the infamous Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope. And it was an iconic endorsement of the principles of nationalism, republicanism, equal rights, liberty, and democracy, recognized as one of the truly great speeches of all time. He did attend seances in the White House, and he is one of the faces that's carved on Mount Rushmore. Here we have Andrew Johnson, the 6th of our military general presidents. He was not considered to be a very good president, probably because Abraham Lincoln had set the quality bar quite high, and Mr. Johnson was just not able to achieve those rights. The slavery question was really still a major issue in the government, even though the Civil War was now over. But the slavery question was still kicking around. Mr. Johnson was very much against giving rights to the freed slaves, which created a lot of problems, obviously. And one thing you could say about Mr. Johnson was that he was a tailor, and he made his own presidential clothes. Here is Ulysses Simpson Grant, the 18th President of the United States, the 7th of our military general presidents. A lot of people question Mr. Lincoln's decision to appoint Mr. Grant as the chief of the army during the Civil War, because Mr. Grant was an alcoholic, a very heavy drinker. But Mr. Lincoln recognized that Mr. Grant was a very, very astute military tactician, and therefore he was the right man for the job. And in the end, he won the Civil War for the North against Mr. Lee. His name was changed. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant, but during some administration foul-up when he entered West Point, the military academy, his name got changed around to Ulysses Simpson Grant. Rutherford B. Hayes, the 8th of our military general presidents. He restored faith in the office of the president after Mr. Johnson's sort of not very good performance. Mr. Hayes did get the attitude of the nation. Accepting the president was a good person. Mr. Hayes was wounded in the Civil War. He was wounded 4 times, as a matter of fact, in the Civil War, and he's the only president to have been wounded in the Civil War. James Abram Garfield, the 9th of our military general presidents, the 2nd president to be assassinated in office. He made notable accomplishments even though he had a short time in office. He created a resurgence of presidential authority against what was called senatorial courtesy in giving executive appointments. In other words, people who were senators especially thought that they had some right to presidential appointments simply because they were senators. And Mr. Garfield said no, he was going to appoint people on the basis of capability rather than the fact that they were just a senator. Mr. Garfield re-energized the American naval power, and he dealt with a lot of the corruption that was embedded in the United States postal system at this particular time. One of the most fascinating things I think about any person I've ever heard is this fact about Mr. Garfield. He was very ambidextrous. He could write Latin with his left hand. He could write Greek with his right hand. But the most amazing fact to me is the fact that he could do it at the same time. Extraordinary. Chester Alan Arthur, the 10th of our military general presidents. He suffered from very poor health and probably should never have been elected to the office of president. He entered the office as it was personally distrusted. People didn't really have faith in him. But he left the office with quite a high approval rating, and people did wind up respecting him. He signed the Pendleton Act, which was probably a notable accomplishment of his, which promoted civil servants on the basis of merit, not the fact that, it's dead man's shoes. The guy above you has to die or leave before you get promoted. And he was a dappy dresser. He was known as Elegant Arthur. Grover Cleveland. Now, he'll appear twice because he's the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So you'll see him here at number 22. He will be repeated at number 24. His biographer, Alan Nevin, wrote this quote about Mr. Cleveland, which I think is really, really fantastic. In Grover Cleveland, the greatness lies in typical rather than unusual qualities. He had no endowments that thousands of men do not have. He possessed honesty, courage, firmness, independence, and common sense, but he possessed them to a degree other men do not. I would like to have that written on my tombstone. Mr. Cleveland was known as the Buffalo Hangman because he had been the sheriff of Buffalo, New York, and he was therefore the executioner. And if you're ever in Philadelphia and you want a little interesting side trip, there's a museum in Philadelphia that has a small tumor that was removed from the roof of Mr. Cleveland's mouth. How about that? Benjamin Harrison, the 11th of our military general presidents. Under his presidency, federal spending reached $1 billion for the first time. $1 billion in the late 19th century. I'd hate to think what that was for today. He unfortunately was rated in the bottom half of the president's listings. During his presidency, electricity was installed in the White House, but Mr. Harrison was afraid of it, so he had the staff go around and turn on and off the lights in the White House. Mr. Cleveland, as the 24th president, repeated, non-consecutive. Here we have William McKinley, Was the third president to be assassinated in office. Was the last Civil War president, that is, a man who served in the Civil War. He was involved in winning the Spanish-American War, which set Cuba free. And he always wore a red carnation in his lapel. Now, do you see a red carnation in his lapel? Could I find a picture of Mr. McKinley with a red carnation in his lapel? No. So here we have the end of part 2 of American Presidents in Bits and Pieces. I hope you've enjoyed it, and that you'll join me again for part 3.